It was a regular Monday morning when my son, Alex, came home from school with an expression I couldn't quite place. His small hands clutched his backpack tightly, his grip so firm it seemed as though he were holding on to a secret. There was a flicker of pride in his eyes, but it was accompanied by something else, uncertainty. As he settled into his usual seat at the kitchen table, he hesitated for a moment, his fingers tracing the zipper of his backpack absent-mindedly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Dad, I told my teacher today that you work at NASA." I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by his confession. "You did?" He nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with excitement. "Yeah, I thought it was cool. I thought she'd be impressed." At first, I assumed it was just another one of Alex's stories. He had always been a bit of a dreamer, often stretching the truth in the way that children do. Not out of malice, but out of a desire to make the world seem more exciting. He was the kind of kid who would claim he could solve math problems faster than his classmates, or that he could outrun the school's track champion. I smiled, thinking this was just another harmless exaggeration, something that would fade into the background like so many other childhood boasts. But then his expression shifted. The excitement drained from his face, replaced by something far less innocent. His lips pressed into a thin line, his small hands curled into fists on the tabletop. "She didn't believe me," he muttered, his voice tinged with something I hadn't expected, hurt. "She called me a liar." My smile disappeared. "What?" Alex looked down at the table, his confidence suddenly crumbling. "She said no kid's dad works at NASA. She told the whole class I was making things up." A wave of frustration rolled through me. NASA wasn't just any workplace. It was the culmination of years of dedication, a place where brilliant minds worked tirelessly to push the boundaries of human knowledge. It wasn't some outlandish fantasy that a child would invent. It was my reality. I had sacrificed time, energy, and endless hours of effort to earn my place there. And now my son, my own flesh and blood, was being ridiculed for telling the truth. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, trying to temper my frustration. "Alex," I said, keeping my voice gentle, "you know your dad works at NASA. You know it's true. That's what matters." I reached out, ruffling his hair in an attempt to comfort him, but he barely reacted. His wide eyes, once filled with excitement, were now clouded with something deeper, doubt. It wasn't just about being called a liar. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way he avoided my gaze. He wasn't just upset, he was questioning himself. The unwavering belief he had in his father, in the things he knew to be real, had been shaken. The words of an adult, someone he had been taught to trust, had planted a seed of uncertainty in his young mind. And that stung. "Dad," he whispered, his voice small. "Why would she say that? Why would she say no kid's dad works at NASA?" The question hung in the air, heavier than I expected. I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Some people don't understand things, son," I said gently. "They see something that doesn't fit into their world, and instead of trying to believe it, they dismiss it. But you and I, we know the truth. And that's what matters most." Alex gave me a half-hearted nod, but I could tell the wound hadn't healed. Over the next few days, I noticed the change in him. He came home quieter, his usual spark dimmed. He barely spoke about school, and when I tried to bring it up, his answers were clipped vague. Anything to avoid talking about Mrs. Foster. And then, one evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, him pretending to focus on his homework and me pretending not to notice how distracted he was, he finally broke the silence. "Dad," he said suddenly, his voice hollow. "I don't want to go." I looked up from my laptop, surprised. "Go where?" "Parents' night." I frowned, setting my laptop aside. "Why not?" "I thought you were excited to show me your classroom." Alex hesitated, his fingers tightening around his pencil. I don't want to deal with her. Mrs. Foster." I exhaled slowly, watching him. His usual enthusiasm, the eagerness he always had when talking about school, was gone. The weight of what had happened was still pressing on him, heavier than I had realized. That was when I knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just about proving a point. It was about standing up for my son. For the truth. For everything I had worked so hard to build. And I had a feeling that when parents' night came, Mrs. Foster was going to find herself at a complete loss for words. Alex nodded without lifting his gaze, the mere mention of her name making him visibly uneasy. It wasn't just a passing frustration or the remnants of a bad day. This was something deeper, something that had been gnawing at him. The sight of my son, usually so full of enthusiasm, now weighed down by doubt and discomfort, sent a sharp pang through my chest. Mrs. Foster had always been known as a strict but generally fair teacher. But now, seeing the way Alex shrank at the thought of her, I knew she had done more damage than she realized. Her words had not only embarrassed him in front of his peers, but had also planted a dangerous seed of self-doubt in his young mind. That wasn't something I could ignore. For a moment, I debated whether I should address the situation directly with her. But the more I considered it, the more I knew I had no choice. This wasn't just about a careless comment. It was about standing up for my son, ensuring he never questioned the truth of what he had known all his life. The night of the parent-teacher meeting arrived, and as I stepped into the school gymnasium, a strange tension hung in the air. Groups of parents gathered in clusters, murmuring about their children's progress, their grades, and the challenges of the coming year. The hum of conversation was familiar, but for me, this night wasn't just about routine discussions. It was about something far more personal. Across the room, I spotted her. Mrs. Foster stood near a table, engaged in polite conversation with a pair of parents, her expression carefully composed. As I approached, I saw the moment she noticed me. Her posture stiffened ever so slightly, her polite smile turning rigid, her greeting as practiced as it was insincere. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice carefully measured. "How are you?" "I'm doing well, thank you," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "How has Alex been doing?" There was the briefest flicker of hesitation in her expression before she masked it with a professional smile. "Alex is a bright boy," she began, her tone smooth. "But there was a bit of a misunderstanding earlier this week. I wanted to clarify something." I folded my arms, waiting. She glanced around as if ensuring no one else was within earshot before continuing. "Alex told me that his father works at NASA," she said, pausing as if expecting me to react. Now, of course, I had no way of knowing whether that was true. I'm sure you understand how unusual such a claim sounds, given his age and, well, the circumstances. A small, dismissive shrug accompanied her words, as if the matter were of little consequence. Her tone was casual, almost indifferent, as though my son's humiliation had been nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to let my frustrations spill over. I met her gaze evenly. "Actually," I said, my voice unwavering, "I do work at NASA, and I'm proud of the work I do." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, her lips parting slightly before she quickly recovered. "Alex wasn't making things up," I continued, keeping my tone calm but firm. "And I don't appreciate you calling him a liar in front of his classmates. Frankly, I think you owe him an apology." The color drained slightly from her face. Her hands, which had been loosely clasped together, tensed. For a moment, she seemed to struggle for a response. "You might not have believed him," I added, "but that doesn't change the fact that you undermined a child's trust and humiliated him over something that was completely true." A few parents standing nearby had begun to take notice of the exchange. One mother, holding a young child in her arms, glanced in my direction and gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. The atmosphere around us shifted, the quiet murmur of conversations slowing as people sensed the weight of what was unfolding. Mrs. Foster swallowed, her gaze darting to the phone in my hand as I pulled up a picture. It was a shot of me at the Johnson Space Center, standing beside a project I had spent months working on. I turned the screen toward her. "Here," I said simply. "This is me working on a NASA project. If you need further proof, feel free to look me up." She stared at the image, her expression faltering. A small tremor ran through her fingers, and for the first time that evening, she truly looked uncertain. The confidence, the casual dismissal, all of it wavered in the face of undeniable evidence. I didn't mean to," she started, her voice suddenly quieter. I assumed." She trailed off, her gaze shifting downward. A deep, awkward silence settled between us before she finally spoke again, this time her tone different, smaller, hesitant. "I'm sorry," she said, barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have doubted him. I'll make sure to speak to him and let him know I was wrong." I gave a small nod, but the apology, though necessary, didn't erase the deeper issue. It wasn't just about one mistake. It was about the ease with which she had dismissed a child's truth simply because it didn't fit into her expectations. Teachers were meant to be guides, nurturers of curiosity, not sources of doubt. That night, after the meeting had ended, I sat down with Alex and told him everything. I reassured him that even adults make mistakes, that sometimes people let their assumptions cloud their judgment. As I spoke, I watched as a sense of relief settled over him, the weight he had been carrying for days finally lifting. His small smile returned, and for the first time in a while, I saw the spark of confidence back in his eyes. But the real twist came the next day. I received an email from the school principal, an apology for what had happened and a request for a private meeting. The tone of the message was serious, and as I read further, I understood why. The principal had looked into the situation, and in doing so, had uncovered a troubling pattern. Mrs. Foster had a history of making unfair assumptions, particularly about students from non-traditional or unconventional backgrounds. There had been prior complaints, quiet concerns raised by parents before me, but this was the first time her behavior had escalated to such a public and undeniable level. The principal assured me that action was being taken. Mrs. Foster would be reassigned to another class the following semester. No other student would have to endure the same kind of dismissal and humiliation that Alex had. It was a relief, knowing that no other child would have to question their own truth because of one teacher's prejudice. But as I sat there, staring at the email, a deeper thought lingered in my mind. How many other children had suffered under her doubt? How many had been made to feel small, unheard, simply because no one had spoken up? That night, as I tucked Alex into bed, I felt something shift within me. A renewed sense of purpose. A reminder of why it's important to stand up, not just for ourselves, but for those who haven't yet found their voice. As I turned off the light and watched my son drift into sleep, I felt a quiet sense of pride, not just in Alex, but in the power of truth itself.